Good evening. My name is Gustafson. I'm the head of landscape architecture at the Knowlton School. It's my great pleasure to introduce not one, but two distinguished Glimcher distinct professors tonight, Jennifer Guthrie and Shannon Nichol, to my left. For those of you who are not familiar with the Glimcher professorship, it was established thanks to the generosity of distinguished alumna at Glimcher, and has been a fantastic resource for our students and faculty. Each spring since 2001, we have invited a leading practitioner to engage with students in making, discussing, and rethinking landscape themes and projects. This year, we have had the chance to welcome Shannon Nichol and Jennifer Guthrie as the 13th Glimcher professors and the first women Glimcher professors. Yeah. Across a series of meetings and conversations, Jennifer and Shannon have worked with a group of landscape architecture students led by Assistant Professor Jake Boswell to interpret and revisit the city beautiful through the lens of landscape architecture. By reading and contextualizing Cleveland's 1903 so-called group plan by Burnham, Carrier, and Brunner, students have set up a framework for understanding Gustafson, Guthrie, and Nichol's own 2011 downtown Cleveland group plan. Tonight you'll be able to see in the Vanguard Gallery the result of this dialogue across time and across geography, since Jennifer and Shannon are based in Seattle. Calling it a result, in fact, is probably a misnomer, as the essence of this collaboration, or this collaborative project, is really about process rather than result. But come see the work after the lecture when the exhibition opens. The office within which they operate, Gustafson, Guthrie, Nichol, has a name that may seem neutral at first glance. No commas, no and, you know, those tricky and that make you seem like you're appended to the other two. Just the alphabetically ordered Gustafson, Guthrie, Nichol. Yet behind this almost corporate label lies a fairly unusual structure established in 1999 by Jennifer Guthrie and Shannon Nichol, respectively out of school 6 years and 2 years, with the internationally renowned landscape architect Catherine Gustafson, 3 women with different educational, professional, and life experiences, sharing a common ground and a couple of $1,000s apparently on each credit card of the participants. The office has now 30 people or so. I mentioned ground, and ground is an essential term for their practice, perhaps reflecting the Gustafson topographic matrix. You're certainly familiar with the sensuous sculptural topographies of Catherine Gustafson's Shell headquarters in France, or the hypnotically seductive ring of the Lady Diana's Memorial Fountain in London. You can read in Shannon and Jennifer's practice a similar affinity for a clearly defined ground plane and sober detailing. For instance, the 2004 Lurie Garden in Chicago's Millennium Park reconstructs an imaginary topography of dark and light plates surrounded by muscular hedges with an equally imaginary perennial urban garden on top of a parking garage. Other notable projects include the North End Parks on top of Boston Big Dig, completed in 2007, the 2008 Towards Paradise, the first landscape installation at the Venice Biennale, and the 2011 Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation campus. For those of you who thought that the building would be enough for a foundation, they get an entire campus. These are they're highly visible and highly publicized projects that have garnered numerous awards, which I won't list here. But there is a more tranquil side to Shannon and Jennifer's concern with the role and place of landscape in the public realm. Their winning project for the Union Square National Mall in DC, or the Pike Pine circulation plans for Seattle, for instance, call for a paradoxical assessment and epithets. You can think of deep surface or strong minimalism. This is tactical urbanism that is not light-hearted, however. It requires political negotiations, for instance, traffic engineers and the federal government, to yield sober interventions for maximum impact. And I'm delighted that Shannon and Jennifer were able to present the diversity of their practice to the students in the seminar and to us tonight. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Dorothy. That was a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming tonight. And we particularly want to thank this group for hanging with us for the last few months, and particularly to Jake and team for leading us all through this amazing last few months. We very, very much enjoyed this talented group of students and certainly the faculty. So it's been an awesome ride for us. The exercise that we went through was a test of all senses. It was not only research and studying into a particular place, but it was going there and seeing it and feeling it, which is a totally different emotion to add on to research, and finding a way to distill all of the information that you discover along the way into 2 boards that you should go and see today, and as the exhibit is open. It was an impressive experience. So we're certainly impressed not only by the thinking that was generated in the seminar, but also by the noticeably articulate presentations of this group, very well spoken, and by this great gift that this seminar has given to the city of Cleveland. We're excited to see their response to this. So this is only the second time that Shannon and I have presented together. So pull on your hats for the next hour, hang tight with us, and we'll try to be as smooth as we can, but we're looking forward to speaking to you all.
That's quite a build-up. I think it'll be kind of tame, but and we have presented together in a non-lecture setting. There was just one other lecture setting like this, and we had a great time, so we were thrilled at the generosity of bringing both of us here. Hopefully it'll give you an insight about how practices work, being more than one person at a time, usually speaking. So there's that artificiality to lectures at times, where you're getting one person's lens of the work done by groups of people. So just as a bit of an introduction to the firm, we're actually just going to focus on 4 projects, which Jennifer will outline a little bit more when I'm done with this general introduction. Dorothy, other than how flattering it was, I think she really had it right about the things that we focus on in our practice. This is the Lurie Garden. It was our launching project for the firm. We entered a competition really seeing ourselves as nobodies and just getting lucky that we were invited because Catherine had just joined us in our firm in 2000. But what I think the influence this shows, and maybe people tend to associate most with us when we first meet them, is this idea of this kind of big ground that we like to try to establish. We like to try to bring the feeling of landscape that is strong in scale and really part of the Earth's surface into these tough sites in the city that are relatively bound on all sides. The landscapes that often affect us all the most, that are natural, have a certain scale to them, and that's part of the beauty, serenity, and sense of immersion, is you have that luxury of scale in the land. When we don't have that, we have to figure out other tricks to make the land feel like it's big and strong and saying something to you, even while being somewhat subtle and peaceful. So the Lurie Garden is definitely an example of that early influence, and that our early influence working when we were still in school, actually, our first work we did with Catherine. But at the same time, when you're trying to make this big, subtle, strong ground that's almost trying not to be too prominent, and it just feels like a piece of the surface of the earth, detailing becomes really important. And in parallel to the big ground projects that we've done, the big landscape projects we've done a series of projects where we're even inside of buildings. We love details. We basically focus on projects where we can carry it through to detailing and construction administration. But projects like the Patent Office Building in DC, which is at the National Portrait Gallery, that's a project about detailing really in the landscape being what helps 2 very different eras of high-stakes monumental architecture dialogue with each other, Foster and Partners architecture and the Greek Revival Patent Office Building. That love of detailing in our office has driven us to do standalone objects like line furniture for landscape forums, and even temporary installations like the Biennale in Venice in 2008. But I would say that the thing we keep coming back to, and actually as a firm has evolved since 1999 to today, is a love of having that context, that imperfect context that we have to glue ourselves to or pull through and can't ignore. which when you're just making a standalone object, you don't necessarily have that frustrating but thick, interesting puzzle to solve. So those kinds of projects, the projects between buildings, you're not going to see them in your magazines necessarily. A lot of times people look at them and don't know who did what between the architects, the landscape architects. Our work kind of disappears and integrates into a whole environment when we do that, but we love that because we feel like we're fixing a complicated space. And more of our work as landscape architects as we work in retrofitting existing urban spaces rather than in green fields and creating brand new parks. More and more of our work is going to be like that. It's about integrating with all these open-ended nerve endings that are convening in these spaces of existing and new stuff. So that's really the shared theme in some way of the office and in the group that we have in the office. They're all problem solvers. They all have different strengths and personalities, but that love of gnarly problems and that survival skill of being surrounded by more than one client and a lot of different complicated things you're trying to solve in the most subtle and deceptively simple way. That's kind of our deal. And in trying to fix things, we often research about what the site used to be. What are some ideas or some ecological things that weren't broken at some point or can help guide us? And often we get big value out of that because we might just have a small site in a city and it might be part of Olmsted's plan or L'Enfant or Burnham. But if we have that small site and we realize if we just click this together again, our site can be much more than just one piece of ground. We can actually reconnect an axis or some kind of connection or movement through a city or restore a historic plan. So the exhibit that the students have so beautifully contributed to is really around that theme about fixing, retrofitting, understanding what you're working with before you make your design move, and really working with existing and pre-existing historic ideas in your work. So this is Cleveland, and you can see on the left it was what I would consider a broken project. People in Cleveland call it Mall A, Mall B, and Mall C instead of the mall, which was a really interesting early indicator to us of the problem. And you couldn't walk in a straight line across the street from one space to another. So a lot of what we did here was repairing urban connections in the street grid, but at the same time we found that repairing that function aligned with repairing this monumental, buried treasure of a historic plan by Daniel Burnham and his collaborators. So repairing history also helps inspire communities to rediscover their heritage. And this project, and the reason why this exhibit is so important, is that it's part of helping a beautiful city rediscover its heritage and what its natural advantages are that it already has in these historic landscapes. And that's really what our role has been on the project in Cleveland, and it's been really fun to see the students get engaged in that as well.
Okay, so we're going to jump into 4 projects that are part of our project portfolio, and each one of them is tied to this notion of history and forming the roots and foundation of the project. And so I'm going to start off with the Robert and Arlene Pogod Courtyard. This is the patent office building that Shannon had shown before, the interior space. The architect was Foster and Partners for this new addition. But the project itself is in Washington, D.C. And when L'Enfant designed the city, it was designed, this site was designed so that this one block that's, this one block that's framed by the red square was seen from 4 sides. And it was originally intended to be a church, but as the growth of the city evolved, it changed to be this temple of invention, and ultimately became the patent office building, the portrait gallery. 2 buildings that framed an interior, or exterior actually, interior in that the building surrounded it, exterior in that it was open to the sky, courtyard in the middle. And when we were brought into the project, we were brought on relatively late in the process. And one of the great things about being youthful in practice is that you don't know what you don't know. And this project, we were asked to come in and help solve this problem. The client wanted to cover the courtyard space so they can use it. They can use it for events. They wanted to build, and they did, an auditorium and workspaces below it. And then Foster and Partners developed the roof that you see. You see the bumpity bump up top? The roof that spans over the whole top. It's still open to the air. There's a gap around it. Oh, can you see the arrow when we do that? No? Okay.
Well, I'd have to take more time. It's okay. It takes two of us and a laptop, especially after I mess with things. I'm sorry about that.
So here's the original floor plan and the original courtyard scene that you can see. The original space was actually articulated by elements of various scales in it. You can see the pathways that create this unique sort of subdivisions within the space. The trees provide an element of intimacy in their canopy. And then the fountains, which you see in the dark sort of octagonal shapes, are these focal points within it. But this is what was designed, and designed well intentionally by Foster and Partners, because the goal was to create an absolutely flexible space for flexible use of this client. We wanted to bring in anything from movable planters to movable chairs to stages to elements that they could have, anything from just a celebration, a small celebration to an inaugural ball in there. But when you work in Washington, D.C., there are several historic committees that are responsible for reviewing the work. And they got pretty far without the historical committee coming on board. And what that group said is, you need to bring back in a garden into this space. It can't be this one grand space.
But it has to be on wheels.
It has to be on wheels for a couple of reasons, trying to have a movable garden, but construction was underway. So they'd already built out the auditorium below, they'd already built out the offices below, and we had a 9-inch sandwich between the ceiling below and the floor that we're building on top of. So as you all know, you can't put plants in a 9-inch sandwich and have them have any sense of garden. So we had to get creative. But what we did was step back and we thought, well, how do you recreate garden? How do you recreate garden that had such an important historical context? So we looked at images of mostly Victorian images of what a garden felt like in that kind of time, what an event space also felt like. But ended up thinking that this was something that might be a little bit closer to what we're aiming for. You still see and appreciate the architecture, the garden that's part of that. And it gives them both their own personality, the architecture and the landscape. Then we started analyzing the site itself. This is the original garden, and broke it down a little bit more. And you could see that actually the space is not symmetrical. It might be symmetrical, no, it's never symmetrical. I was thinking in maybe one way, a lateral line, it might be symmetrical, but really it's not. So the spaces are varied. And the asymmetry actually gives you a range of spaces when you break them down. The purple squares around these nodes and intersections of fountains and pathways, and then the lighter purple squares defining the spaces framed by paths. In addition to that, we really had to think about the future. How do you get garden in the space that has that 9-inch section? We were fortunate enough to have an in-house group of landscape gardeners that are responsible for the Smithsonian collection, Smithsonian institutions. And we worked with them to develop, and then we also had Dan Hinckley, who was our botanical advisor. If you guys know Dan, he's amazing with plants. Help advise not only on how do you bring landscape into the middle of space, light levels, soil depth, but how do you maintain them? And then how does that work in an environment that has precious, expensive sculpture and portraiture? And we're able to develop a system of planting depths and locations, but also a plan to remove them and pull them away from the wall of the buildings. And pulling them away from the wall of the buildings wasn't anything technical. It was a design decision to make sure that you read the architecture all the way down to the ground, and then the landscape started separately from that. And it actually ended up floating through the space. So you can see in this layout where we landed these sort of boats of planters moving through the space create the individual areas. They're asymmetrical, but at the same time you can get this tripartite layout that relates to the bumpity bumps of the canopy above. There are 3 bumps. It is not a technical term, and Foster and Partner does not use that.
I think pyrite would be a triple bubble instead of a double bubble.
It's just between us in this room. It was, and as they were looking for the flexibility of space, a lot of study happened on how do you have a variety of events in here, trying to give this group comfort that you can actually get a concert in there or dinner or other events, and make sure that it also felt comfortable when there was an event in there. This is just a detail of one of those planters. It's actually very thin wall. Not only do we have a limited requirement in depth, but in weight as well. There wasn't intended to be soil or anything sitting on top of this roof, so we had to be very conscious of that. So jointing became very important in the detailing, and you can see some thicker joints moving around this planter, and that was disguising thinner joints that were actually framing this planter. I always like to show this one because it gives you a sense of scale. The building, the roof was already installed when we came on board, and so getting planting in was tricky. Either you're limited to a door or an elevator, and that basically gives you maybe a 6 or 8 foot tree. That wasn't going to be enough to make the space feel like a space upon opening day. So they came through the roof with a crane. You can see the scale of the people up on top. And what it looked like coming through. So that was another important thing that we had staff to maintain these elements, because you don't want them to die, because replacing them gets tricky. And then you can just see how the space evolved, looking through in different vantage points to get a sense of almost thickness. And variety. The planters are wide enough that people can sit on them and occupy them in any way if they'd like to. This is that view that you saw before. You can see what it feels like during the day. Water is an important part of a lot of our work, and in this case, as it is in many other cases, it provides a level of activation and reflection that you can't get from a lot of other materials. So it fills up the space in a way and makes it feel active and full, even when there are a handful of people in it. But this water feature is thin. It's only a 1/4 inch thick, and it is on a very, very soft slope to keep it moving, because then you can turn it off and occupy the space for a bigger event. And even though we're showing kids standing on it, which is really fun, I'd say the biggest client that the water feature gets are adults. And they feel, you just sort of feel like you're being sort of devious, that you can actually go and you can walk on water. Because you can, and then and walk off it, and you don't end up in the portrait gallery with water in your feet. It's been placed so the water dries before you walk in.
There's some interesting mock-ups for that one. This next project, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it would be different from the project Jennifer just talked about, because one way you could categorize the project Jennifer just talked about is when we're brought in to help our architect friends and work with them when something about the landscape might become more challenging than it was initially thought it was going to be. So a lot of times we're brought in, this has become controversial, can you come in and help? Or that project was really the one she just talked about. We were called, can you design some movable planters? This project is when we get brought in from the very beginning with architects. In this case, architects that we hadn't worked much with before, which was NBBJ Architects. They have an office in Seattle, and I know they have a great presence here as well. But this was our site. So when we were brought in, it was from sustainability and campus planning onward, and really working with the architects and developing a design with them for the campus. So this site's 13 acres of asphalt parking lot. It is a tough site. It was a tough site because this, let's see, you can't see that. This whole neighborhood is sort of an event parking district. We all know what those sort of neighborhoods are like. Even though it's pretty close to the downtown core, as you can see in the site or the photo on the right. And it's a place where it's really hard to imagine people walking or wanting to stand still because it's ringed with arterials on all three sides of those of the triangular site. So, talking about the theme of fixing and repairing and looking what's there and around the site and how that can drive design, we were looking with this design to fix or sort of put back the pieces for, on the left, the natural history of the site. This parking lot that's actually on a kind of plateau was shooting dirty water into the drains that were going into the water bodies on either side. It was basically the peak where it divides into two watersheds. So we found out that the site used to be a bog, a really wet meadow area. And usually with these remnant sites that feel like the most boring sites in a city, there's a really interesting reason why they're developed slower or more into the big box or later, more modern development in the city. It's probably because there was something inconvenient naturally about the land. Very often they were wet areas, or there was a waterway that went through, or something like that. So it's kind of interesting that the most sort of bleak appearing sites have the most interesting texture in their natural history. So, bog, we thought that's kind of an interesting landscape type to think about for a campus. But how can we restore that sort of sense of place for people who were spending their days there and their days in Seattle? And then on the right, just looking at, it had been a neighborhood for a few decades. Seattle's history isn't that old, but thinking about the urban texture, the sort of unit size of a block, even though this whole thing is a campus, we looked at that unit size of the neighborhood, and if you're in one part of the neighborhood and you're looking across, trying to get that sense of scale back in, and when you're walking along those long triangular edges, that you're passing things that feel like block openings. So, natural history and urban fabric. And then, of course, there's this incredibly intimidating influence of this client, that where do you begin in trying to interpret in a landscape design the kind of work that the Gates Foundation takes on. We experienced with the architects a series of just conversations with the client over months about their physical identity. They did not have one when we started the project. They are a vector for other people's work, and they're very mindful of that. They have a mantra about being humble and mindful. They kind of don't exist physically in a way. They want to support the work of their grantees. So they aren't the ones coming up with the medicines and things like that. They're supporting people who are, and they want the attention to be on them. So designing a campus when they had just been renting these really nondescript buildings around town, which was cozy for them, comfortable for them, was a challenge. The other driver from the client was, from the beginning, they wanted to have water, a big presence of water features on the site, and they wanted the campus to be very serene and timeless. So water, serene, and timeless. At the same time, kind of in tension with that, as we worked with the architects through a number of schemes that were serene, timeless, and had water, there was a moment when the co-chairs said, okay, this is serene, timeless, and has water, but they said the architecture needed to become a little more inspiring and surprising and bold. So the architects went back to the drawing board and they came up with these diagrams about global reach, optimism, not just being contextual and sort of grid-like. So we worked with the architects really closely to say, okay, what are we going to do to both be a good neighbor, be that super local, grounded, humble, and mindful foundation, but also be the optimistic global scale, like definitely not just local foundation. So we came up with this scheme that on the top row, those are the buildings the architects came up with. On the bottom row, we have what we call the green grid Hershey bar, and it's like this green gridded bog layer. That kind of makes sense. Doesn't sound very pleasant, but we did our best to try to make it a very pleasant place. We took the neighborhood grid and as our sort of no-nonsense kind of form giver. And so everything's linear, rational, rigorous, like the work of the foundation. And then that's kind of a foil to let those boomerang buildings float above as they're sort of foreign objects that engage with a whole different scale. So this is the plan that we came up with for that. You can kind of see through the trees that there's basically a linear, very quiet system in the way the landscape's organized. There's a central plaza, which is sized not only for fire truck access, but for pretty large events, including the International Toilet Technology Fair that's held there every year. That usually gets a lot of press attention. It's pretty amazing. And then if you look there, you can see the light green rectangles. Those are the product of the architects and us working together, and the architects being incredibly collaborative and responsive. If those white buildings would have projected all the way down to the ground and that was their footprint, it would not have helped us to make those streets feel more two-sided and urban and neighborhood. So what they did is they took the ground floor of their buildings and the podium layer of their buildings and they made them sort of lock into our green grid, and they aligned with the edges of the streets so that when you're walking down the street, there's the pedestrian level, there's windows and walls and doors that face you. And then you look up and there's this upper level of buildings that are not about the local. I won't get into this, but during the course of working on this project for 8 years, a freeway appeared on one edge, which sort of took us backward a few decades. But that led into a whole other series of projects for us, trying to fight for crosswalks in places that they wouldn't normally be around a state highway and things like that. And that really launched us into a series of street and traffic projects that have gone on from there. To restore the function of the bog, the project captures or reuses, absorbs as much rainwater as possible. We have a 1 million-gallon cistern. The whole thing's on a rooftop, I should mention that. That whole 13 acres is pretty much on a rooftop. There's a 1 million-gallon cistern underneath that plaza. The plaza captures the water and uses it for toilet flushing, the rainwater features in the garden, etc. And that was the way we wanted to answer the client's interest in water features, was being really mindful and thoughtful with every drop of water and then sharing that water in a really serene way, not an ostentatious way as is done in some office campuses. There's about 3.5 acres of conventional green roofs on the site, or extensive green roofs. They're 5 inches thick. They absorb over 95% of the water that hits them over the course of the year. Only 5% of the water that hits them actually ends up in the drain, the roof drain. And then this is the center of the campus, and you can see the rainwater gardens, which are from that collected water off of the non-vehicle surfaces of the site, all over a rooftop. And that was really one of our challenges. How do you create this sense of groundedness, depth, solidity, and permanence? It's also a 100-year project when you're all on a rooftop. So we did everything we could to imply this depth and darkness to the water, the soil, almost like it's this wet, heavy, super thick slab that goes down to the middle of the earth. And what you see on the left is a reference image of a bog that's in the area, a local bog, and it has that kind of glowing, spongy edge to it. And then it's clear, clean water, but it's reflective and dark. And it's the kind of place you would feel contemplated in rather than astounded by the display of water. So this is how we carried that out. This is basically, this is looking at the edge of the pool, combination of native plants, edible blueberry plants to sort of recreate that feeling, but the trick was they also needed to be drought tolerant because it's not actually a wet soil matrix. And then using concrete, this is just concrete with a custom form liner that kind of has we kind of thought of it as like slicing through this bog peat. So it implies that there's this depth, and we carry that exact same detail and form liner series all the way around the outside edge of the site along the street. So that the same detail, same material quality is in the heart of the campus as is next to you on the sidewalk as you're walking down the sidewalk. First impression of the campus is about that linear simplicity, rigor, There's some very serious topics that are discussed here, so there's a quietude. But when you get close, this is scrap cobble from Cold Spring granite. It's a byproduct, domestic, nice dark look to it that actually fits really well in the Pacific Northwest. And native plants and that sort of sense of rustic texture that I think allows people to relax and focus when they're in the middle of a professional environment. I always have to put the duck picture in there. It was surprising, you know, on a rooftop landscape with 18 inches of water, how much wildlife moved in quickly. And I think it helped that we have the native reeds. There's a ritual crossing from your office over a wooden bridge to the central space. This is just sort of a collage of details, but it talks about being on structure. So those water features are shallow. We contained the plantings in plastic pots that are actually sunk into the gravel. So it doesn't look like a bunch of containers, but it is. It makes it a little easier to manage. And this is that, you know, one of the streets that we were told no one will ever walk there at several of the community meetings. So why are you trying to widen the sidewalk and put seating there and things like that? But it's, now the neighborhood's just developed around it and people couldn't imagine it any other way. And I just say, that's something really important for you to be able to do, is imagine when people say, no one will ever walk there, because they can't imagine a part of the city being any different than it is. If you imagine it and pretend and just keep moving with it, you can make it happen. I'm going to skip that one.
All right, now I'm going to take us to Venice a little bit. This was an exhibit that we did for the Venice Biennale. It was the Architecture Biennale, and we were the first landscape architects to be invited by this from Aaron Betsky, who's a colleague and friend of Captain Gustafson. And at that time, this was 2009, 2008, 2008. We were slammed. We were so busy, and you know, here comes a friend and a colleague who says, "I've got this great opportunity. It's just a $40,000 exercise. That's how much they give you to do these things. Will you do it?" But the schedule is so busy, and so you basically have a month to develop a design. You have to find people who will build it in Italy, which wasn't part of our group of people that we worked with before. And just do it. And so, you know, Shannon and I just said, no, yes, you know, yes, finally, yes. And it just about killed us, this project did, but we were so proud of what happened.
Just about killed each other.
Proud of how it resulted, because it wasn't the rhythm that we had fallen into of, you know, 3-month schematic design, 4-month design development, 6-month CD process. It was thinking on your feet, thinking quickly, developing it, figuring out how to build it. In Venice, the materials aren't there on site, and you have to barge everything in. So figuring all of that stuff out and just going with it. So for those of you who have been to the Biennale, this is the Portery. I think that's how you say it, or it's something similar to that. And it's the old cord making part of the site. And this was a display that was done by Zaha Hadid. Basically, it's architectural and art exhibits throughout the whole space. At the end of the Arsenale and this building, you end up at this landscape, and Aaron said there's this beautiful landscape, and who knew that there was such thing as a garden or a landscape on the island of Venice that's so hardscaped and built out. There was about an acre large, an acre. So this was actually this is a historic site of a Benedictine nunnery. It was in the 1800s. And it had been overgrown by blackberries. This was it when it was first seen. You know, they said, do something with it. What do you want to do? We also had to fundraise for this project. So in order to have impact on this, there's a whole nother thing that we had not ever done before, is figure out how to afford to do something in this space that had been overgrown. Because
that was the toughest part.
You have to put yourself out there, and that in itself was a challenge to to ask. So bramble and ivy all throughout the space, but beautiful and interesting structures that were there and sprinkled around. So we developed this idea called Towards Paradise. And the idea for it was, first, this is defining your path to enlightenment. So first, take stock, think about your life. Next, nourish your life, make it healthy. And last, step forward into your path of enlightenment, your place of enlightenment. So 3 spaces. This is basically the site, and the dark green and texture that you see there remained the bramble that we carved ourselves through. And the 3 spaces are, this is take stock, this is nourishment, and this is enlightenment. I'm going to walk through those right now. But anecdotally, these are our Venetian landscapers, shirtless and all, and neither of us got to do a site visit for that. Awkward for Shannon, I would have enjoyed it. But here they are. And basically having to, because this had been covered over for so long, get in there and scrape it all out, haul in dirt by barge, bring in plants. But Venice and Italy has a tremendous legacy of gardens, as you all know. So actually finding gardeners or suppliers who are willing to be part of our plan of developing a garden on a very fast timeline, they were there. And part of it in the area that they're in right now is the Nourish area, which was actually a garden, a vegetable garden, a place where you can go and pick herbs and fruit and vegetables and nourish your soul. And they were all built again here.
And the nunnery, this site had a food garden. That was its main use, and when it was a nunnery. So the food garden is about that and that kind of pragmatic relationship with the land, and then the Enlightenment is more about spirituality and religion and that part of the heritage of the site.
So walking through the site, it's basically wonderful marble, crushed marble from Italy, this white marble that leads you through from place to place. The first space in taking stock was in an old shed-type structure, and the idea there was to stop and notice plants and botanical elements that have gone extinct. So you can see here, this is the image and the idea that we developed to share with Aaron and team to see if they were on board with it. And this is the actual execution of it. So dark boards, white letters, the names of all of these extinct plants, and a black light on it so that they glowed, and candles around the room. Taking you down the path into nourishment through sort of garden structures and garden language. This was the vision. It was filled to the brim, lush and overflowing, full of nourishment. And in this case, the grand opening happened in September, and the gardeners were able to, they had enough time, and they worked back and forth with us to understand what actually could be grown in the timeline that we were looking at. But planted elements that were all fruiting or going to vegetable at about the same time. So not a natural garden necessarily where you see things kind of growing and fruiting over the course of the summer. They were all doing their thing right about in September. It was pretty spectacular. A little bit like going to a home and garden show in a way. So you can see all the elements in place. Everything was there, and so you can walk through and pick and eat, nibble. And then we're heading towards enlightenment as you move through. And this was the vision for enlightenment. It was very simple. And so green grass, unsculpted land, beanbags kind of thrown around where you can just sit and contemplate. And then above and overhead was this thing, this element that floated above you. And that took some thought to figure out what that could be. And we ultimately landed on sailcloth, white sailcloth attached to atmospheric balloons. And we had our own balloon wrangler there on site who basically was responsible for keeping the balloons inflated and moving. And it was hot. We were there at the time where it was just about ready to turn into monsoon season, so it was really hot. Balloons were popping, and that guy was working really hard so people could float it.
We were helping on that too. We were wrinkling balloons and getting all sweaty, and then
And so here it is when you move into it. You can see, just kind of poke through the trees and the shrubs, and you see the sailcloth going. But it's sort of mesmerizing to be standing there because the sailcloth then takes its own form and shape. You see the balloons moving, kind of waving around, and all of a sudden somebody is exposed, and you're drawn towards this path to have a place to sit and kind of linger, and the sailcloth just comes down and touches you and moves back up into the air. And it's open throughout the evening, so you can see that lighting is thrown on it and changed. It has its own sensory experience and sound that brings you towards enlightenment.
So if you can stand it, we have one more project. I think I'll try to make this fast. This one's really different. It is about a streets master plan and trying to do a master plan that doesn't feel like a master plan. It also was a project that we saw the RFP for in our hometown for a master plan for redoing street furnishings and paving standards for downtown streets to sort of pull its retail district together and update it. There's a lot of downtowns, and a lot of you are going to be working on these projects around the country where they're financial and retail centers. They used to be the star Class A office space. The younger tech companies and younger people don't really want to be in those districts anymore because they feel a little corporate and dated, or big brand retail. So it's kind of becoming a common project. We went in an interview for this project thinking we were not going to get it. We also thought there was a $50,000 budget, which was a typo. But we went in an interview and said, we think it's so great you're doing this project to redo 65 acres. We said, this is 65 acres of space. It's streets of downtown. It's the downtown core of Seattle. But we said, we don't think you need to redo the pavement. We think the problem that we really have in repositioning the downtown core is about the way streets are used. It's about making them more pedestrian friendly and making them feel more vibrant and expressive of Seattle's culture. So we said, there's a lot of great neighborhoods that we compete with that have cracked concrete and mismatched furnishings, and they're fine. So then we left, and they called us and said, we totally agree with you. Can you do this? And this is the Downtown Seattle Association. And we went, whoa, okay, now we have to figure out how to do it, and how to do this thing about rethinking streets, doing a master plan for revitalizing the street life in a downtown without depending on fancy pavement and banners and hanging baskets and furniture that we might think is cool right now, but it's probably going to look dated in another 5 years. So there's a few key things that drive this. I won't get too much detail about any of them, but Seattle is a hill town, as those of you who visited and walked around it a lot attested. The cool thing about that is you'd think the whole city feels like it's right on the water, but like so many cities, there's a bluff at the water's edge, then there was fill that puts distance between the water and the city, and we have a freeway that runs through the city. So what we suggested was that we use this project, the green scope. You can see we've popped out across the freeway, and we've pushed it down to touch the waterfront project, and said the regular city streets should just continue across the freeway in a regular urban manner, and they should continue down to touch the water. Which doesn't sound very radical, but it kind of is, because people often have that feeling that a waterfront is a special district. There's these different neighborhoods that should all have their own paving. We're saying, no, actually, if you normalize and connect, you can connect into some really good stuff and just be a great urban place. This is Seattle. A lot of you think of it as a pedestrian and bike mecca. This is 2nd and Stewart in the heart of our core. This is how we treat people. And we were telling this community of business owners, this is not how we treat people, that young mobile professionals that we want to live and work downtown and think they're going to walk around here with their kids. So we on the flip side, we said we know in Seattle and many cities we have these spaces that show that we know how to do this. And so Pike Place Market's on the top, wonderful place to walk. And what you see on the bottom, that pink neighborhood I showed you, you're like, pink neighborhood? What? The pink area on the upper right is Capitol Hill. Vibrant, youthful, gritty in a nice way, community, great pedestrian culture. So what we said is if you can reach down and pull some of that market vibe up, reach up across the freeway, pull some of what Capitol Hill has to downtown, instead of making downtown more monumental, make it feel more like these daily life places, more like the neighborhoods that have street life and groceries and bars, then we can do something. So we came up with a series of ideas that are not about changing the pavement, and I'm only showing a couple of them. One is something we call the Market to Market Scramble, which is this event that just gets people to run, push shopping carts, ride their bike, whatever, up the hill from the Pike Place Market to Melrose Market, which is across the freeway, just to experience that transect and how close those neighborhoods are, and that downtown is part of the neighborhood. And the same thing with the light installation we show there. That's something, it could be a festival, it could be a seasonal thing, but just highlighting the streets as connections between these neighborhood spaces. So here's how we use history in this one. This is a view from the Pike Place Market looking up the hill, up Pike Street, to, you're kind of looking at that pink neighborhood would be at the end of this, at the top of this hill. It doesn't look like much of a hill here, but it is. So, you can see the problem is it's like cluttered. You can't see the storefronts, it's dark. It doesn't look that unpleasant, but when you're walking through there, it's kind of weird. It's like really cluttered with stuff and dated retail painting and graphics. So this is the same view in 1899. So the value in showing this to a client is just look how much change has happened. So if we think that it's a big change to widen the sidewalk, look at how much change has already happened to this very same street. It's a really effective conversation. And in 1936, this image was key to our whole project approach. The reason why is what we're looking at here is in many ways a bigger, more vibrant, sort of big city neighborhood place than what we have in 2015 at that same place. Look at the amount of signage that's reaching out to grab people, the amount of the goods that are on the sidewalk. Every square inch of that pedestrian interface along the street edge is totally maxed out. I would love to walk down that street. So the funny thing is there's no fancy art, like pieces on the sidewalk, there's no custom paving, there's no swirls and footprints and royal blue kiosks telling people which way the waterfront is. And from the standpoint of being a vibrant neighborhood, it's there. So, and there's no street trees. Kind of interesting. So then we look at what happened. So by 1963, we skipped a few decades for this lecture. What happened was we went from maximum every square inch being about catering to local access and the pedestrian taking every step being catered to regional flow. Now, 90% of that street space is dedicated to people traveling 30 or 50 miles on the freeway. This is a freeway on-ramp now, which is how Pike Street was transformed. It's one way. This is not about catering to those local people walking by that live and work in the neighborhood every day. So, the strange thing, though, is that Seattle is one of those cities that almost overreacted to this, or the first attempt to address this was this anti-urban, let's make it feel more like a residential landscape, or more like a home landscape, or a shopping center landscape, so that it doesn't feel like the big bad city of 1963. What's happened is the city's gotten so cluttered feeling in places that it's just not pleasant. They're having a hard time leasing out space, and people don't want to live in certain blocks because they don't feel like they're part of the urban life of the city. So the plan we came up with for the physical aspect, the paving, we did need to come up with a plan because that was part of the original scope, was actually pretty simple, we think. We came up with two kinds of street sidewalk details. One are the north-south streets, which are avenues in Seattle. The distinctive thing about them is the traffic goes really fast on them because they're relatively level. They're like terraces that go along that slope. Most of them are one way, and it is not fun to cross them if you're trying to go up from the water to Capitol Hill. And that is the direction of connection that all of us want to make, including the downtown property owners. So the avenues are strong, they're symmetrical, they're formal, the trees go along because they have good sun access, but they're not fun to cross. So the concept we came up with is strengthen the avenues, make them more of what they already are. These two-sided, lush, tree, totally leafy tree places that feel a little traditional. But if you look at that diagram on the left, what we're saying about the hill streets is like celebrate the fact they're hill streets, almost make them feel kind of like hill climbs or urban versions of the Ketchikan boardwalks, if you've ever been to Ketchikan, Alaska. They kind of march up the hill and have that feeling of ruggedness. But the hill streets win. These east-west streets win when they cross the avenue. So if you're making that inconvenient lug up the hill, when you get to those intersections, you feel like you're stopping traffic on the avenues. So then the question is, well, how are we going to do that? So here's a diagram of how those things start to go together. You see the orange hill streets, which the orange lays on top of the green avenues. The hill streets, in contrast to the avenue, and this is the way things already are in Seattle, they're totally chaos, mess, non-design, funky stuff. We actually said keep it that way, make them more like that, keep them open, don't add lines of street trees. Every master plan you've ever seen, almost, has lines of street trees down both sides of the street. We did not include that on these. And these are where Seattle's sort of like rugged, you kind of feel like you're hiking when you're walking around the city kind of thing. There's kind of still a grunge or like post-grunge, redo grunge thing going on now in Seattle. And that feeling that maybe you could carry your kayak on your head down from your apartment in Capitol Hill down to the water. This is sort of that experience. So when you put those together, this is what it looks like. The two street types intersecting, hill streets win. That keeps the views open to the water, brings the city closer to the water. And it gives you a sense of orientation when you're walking downtown because you know which way you're looking. So some of that is trying to propose Seattleites following rules. This is a libertarian place, maybe liberal, it's also very libertarian at the same time. That's why we have legalized marijuana. So that kind of goes hand in hand with not wanting to have a tree master plan if you're in landscape architecture world. We're suggesting that for the avenues. And then I'm just going to end on this series of before and afters. So this is an avenue before. This is a part of an avenue that doesn't have the trees that we think are a signature of the avenues, enough of a majority condition that we want to get it to be more consistent. So this is our fantasy after view of that same project, same place. And it's interesting to note that the building owner saw this in a presentation that I gave about this, and he said, if you guys design it pro bono, I want to put that parklet in. And we didn't know what he was talking about at first. And he was like, your plan, the Pipeline Renaissance plan, it's about parklets. And we did say avenues are great places for parklets because they're relatively level and they're room-like. People love parklets. We were super into them because we were kind of like, should you have to do a platform to change the use of the street? But hey, we got on the parklet bandwagon and we just had such a great time. So we designed this parklet, it's built, it's basically, realizing that part of our plan and helping people see that the avenues can become more room-like. There wasn't the budget to put street trees in yet, but there's a number of things like this happening all over the city where people have seen the plan and they kind of get it because it seems to be because it's not like a typical master plan and they're seeing cartoons and they kind of get it, which we hadn't done a lot of master plans before, but it was almost like there needed to be a novel approach. So here's a hill street before. Here we show ground level plantings that are absorbing some of the stormwater rolling down the hill, but keeping that view open so that you can see the water, and the water feels you feel like you're in a city that's on the water's edge. And then that red carpet that's coming up from the market-to-market concept, as well as the sort of the hill streets winning at the intersection. This was really key. I showed you that grim picture of the person crossing 2nd Avenue, and I said, this is Seattle, despite our reputation, we don't treat pedestrians well. we're proposing raised intersections at all of those crossings. So every place where a hill street crosses an avenue, which is every intersection of downtown, when people are making that trek, they do not have to step down off of a curb into the avenue's roadbed, which feels like stepping into a sort of in the barrel of something. Instead, your sidewalk continues across at the same level, and the cars have to go up over your street, your sidewalk grade, when they're driving down the avenues. So it's a little misleading in this because it kind of looks like there's a curve, but that dark arc is actually a flush ADA texture device. So yeah, so that's Pipe Pine Renaissance Plan. We're currently working on the second phase of that, and really enjoying it, and it's spurred into a lot of other streets projects that we didn't think we'd necessarily be doing when we were doing a lot of this conceptual landscape and art kind of work when we started the firm. So to conclude, we just hope that the four, sorry that we went a little bit over, but we hope the four projects we showed you show the range of work that landscape architects do. Somebody else could show you another four projects that may be completely different, bizarre range. And this is what we love about being landscape architects. It's all wide open, and each project's a new puzzle to solve. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
I have. Thank you for the save. We're not offended.
To continue on this kind of structure of your office, which is very unusual, given the triumvirate structure with Catherine and these young landscape architects. You also started with a very kind of wow project. I think your first project was pretty high profile, was extremely well received. And typically people build up kind of gardens and benches or balloons or whatever. And so my question is, do you find yourself having these kind of bread and butter projects to sustain these other projects, and what are they?
We definitely did. And when we met Catherine, we were actually maintaining both tracks of small, we were talking about small projects versus the big glamorous ones. I was working at an environmental restoration firm, which was where I thought I was probably going to go in the profession, and doing a series of small community grant-funded projects, and then ended up meeting Catherine because she needed someone to do the graphics for a competition she was entering in the United States. And so that started off this string of projects with Catherine while I was still working at this very small 4-person environmental restoration work, all community grant-funded projects. Jennifer was hired as the big guns to come in and do project management on these big projects, and sat next to me doing massive glamorous projects. I was working on these glamorous projects with Catherine, but at the same time I was hand-drawing interpretive sign illustrations and installing plants and shoreline restorations and things like that. And when we started the office, surprisingly, people did know who Catherine was, but in the US, very few really knew. And from the time we started the office, we have had small projects. We've been a little hard for people to pin down about what do we specialize in, because we don't specialize in anything. So I'd say that there's been a lot of humility and challenge in getting glamorous work, but we've never really been fixated oddly on getting it. And maybe it's because we had the stroke of lightning of winning the competition for the Lurie Garden that we feel like, okay, we can do that, but we're always also really interested in this other stuff too.
We did have the benefit of having worked together, Catherine, Shannon, and I, when Shannon and I were at this other office for about 2 or 3 years. and so had kind of built a working relationship together. Knew that we got along tremendously well, and knew that the three of us were so vastly different in every way that we fit together perfectly well, and that it worked. And there just was this right time for us to jump off and start our own thing. And so we were working out of the back of Catherine's trunk of her car, and pretending like we had an office. And going and interviewing for jobs. Ultimately, I think we got an office, and we were working on upside-down trash cans on our home computers, and
while painting the office ourselves,
and exactly doing all this stuff in order to work together and do fun things together and do these great projects that we just synchronized on tremendously well. But before we started that office, we had done the American Museum of Natural History, Shannon and Catherine primarily together on that, and South Coast Plaza, which is down in California. It's a bridge, landscape architects leading bridge design, 550-foot span, post-tension bridge, and a garden together. So we knew we had the chutzpah to go for it. We knew the kind of projects that we wanted to do together, and we also knew that we were very lucky to have a name associated with that to help us pursue this kind of work. And it just, I think, I would like to think that the clear and easy relationship that we had and already built together translated into these interviews, and we truly, in the best intentioned way, faked everyone out that we actually had an office, because we didn't. But winning those jobs allowed us to do that, and allowed us to build the practice pretty quickly. And hiring people was even a really unique thing, because they knew the name Catherine Gustafson, they didn't know our name. But we were able to lure some people in that way and continue to grow and grow and grow and expand.
Yeah, I'd say that there's merits at your first job or two. Sometimes there's that choice: do I go to a big firm where there's lots of structure and I can be mentored, or do I go into a small firm where there's this risk? A lot of times there's a risk of dysfunction, or just a higher level of risk. We really benefited from a lack of supervision. We had the weight of the world on our shoulders, in our eyes. In the first firm we worked at, there was a lot of autonomy for the very young people that was kind of crazy when I look back, but we were very independent and had to figure everything out for ourselves. And then Catherine just said flat out, she's like, I don't want to run an office. I don't want to be involved in the management of an office, but I'll partner with you. If you guys start an office, I would like to partner with you and be able to, work with you when I bring projects into the U.S. So it's definitely not a typical situation, and it's one we really benefited from, because we had these relationships with people who were more experienced that didn't want to or could not really supervise and mentor us. So we were building an office on our own at the same time as we were benefiting greatly from these adults.
The raised traffic corridors on Renaissance, are you looking to slow down traffic on the avenues like they do at Bell Street, where they have to demo the wall before crossing? Or?
Yeah, the raised intersections are as much about making people feel like they're being cared about. This is much sort of a perceptual thing when they're walking across the intersections, as it is to effectively slow down the speed of traffic on the avenues. As you all may have noticed, those of you who went to Seattle, those avenues, if there's not a traffic jam, the typical speed is 35, sometimes creeping up there to 40 miles an hour on them, because it's multiple lanes one way. So having something physical there, also to remind people there's free right turns in Seattle, as there is in a lot of the US. I think that's going to be going away soon. But reminding people when they're making a right turn that when they get to a certain point past the stop line, they're crossing the realm of people's feet and stroller wheels and babies and legs.
Norm, that as we've talked about in the last few months, over the last several decades, cars have have been the privileged person in our right-of-ways, or privileged object in our right-of-ways. And the notion of changing that back so that people have privilege just as much as cars. We can either find a way to balance that one out, or maybe even overemphasize pedestrians moving through our right-of-ways to give ourselves a greater sense of experience and ownership is the direction that we've been talking about for clients.
I think that soon we won't need things like raised intersections to do that, just like soon I don't think we'll need parklet platforms to, reallocate portions of the street for people to sit in. But the intersections are, they're something physical that we can do that's just, it shows a gesture and it's subtle, but it makes a difference. And Bell Street is somewhat similar. They weren't able to get to the intersections on Bell Street. It was part of the original concept for it. But those of you who don't know Bell Street, it's a park street in Seattle that is basically like a Baumer. It's a concrete, curbless, largely curbless. They ended up having to add some curbs in. But our friend Nate Cormier of SVR Design. Yes?
For the Gates Foundation, you had a number of those great details that are fantastic. How were you able to convey to the contractor the vision of the project? I mean, was there a healthy CA budget, and did you have any challenges with some of the details?
Really great question, because that's where it all, if there's not good communication between us and the contractor, and if there's not CA, we have a real high risk that all of our work will not be evident to the people touching and using the space. We had a good CA budget. We had a wonderful client that was building this project for a 100-year legacy, and quality was the first concern. There was a budget, and it was it caused us to work for it, which is good. That's how the Gates Foundation operates, is getting the most value for every dollar. We've had a wonderful contractor on board from schematic onward, Sellon, and they're a family-owned construction company in Seattle. I know every city has one or more of those construction companies that just have that feeling of being in there because they care about the community. So I think that the pride and honor of working for the Gates Foundation really went through everyone who worked on that site, every plant installer, every concrete installer. Some of the details you saw, we had the opportunity to mock them up, which we don't often have on projects. It's surprisingly difficult to get the budget to do it and get the resources, but those concrete form liner walls, we did 3 different profiles in the form liners before we found one that would actually release without falling. So we had to, for instance, the little ribs that stick out get skinnier as they come toward you, so that there's just enough that they'll release. And we had that opportunity to really get everything right. And also make sure the client understood what they were going to get at that detailed level. So we did mock-ups of the boardwalks, of that edge detail, of the, our kind of call it a floating plaza, really looking at the cantilever, making sure you were going to see the support structure, and things like that. So very, very lucky. And they continue to have us involved as the site's been maintained, and as we make decisions about planting maintenance or other things, which super lucky.
The document set was about this thick too. It was a big one, the level of detail that we brought that project to, which is similar to many projects that we do just out of habit, maybe a realistic understanding that there are some projects that have wonderful contractors involved and some projects that go to the lowest bidder. That a lot of the detailing that we do takes it to shop drawing level. That we really need to be able to detail it all the way out so that literally we end up getting our drawings back as shop drawings to ensure that what goes in is what was intended.
Do you guys have any street tree guidelines? A lot of times street trees block retail signs, and also they don't get their soil, and cities never allocate maintenance funds. So you end
That's so sympathetic to that. Street trees, I think because there was a fad it really seemed to peak in a lot of cities in the 90s about right tree, right place. There's a lot of street trees that aren't really street trees, and so they're just problematic and then they're suffering. But they're like little ornamental trees that have lots of seasonal interest, but the branches are right at like eye and shoulder level. So they're not creating and framing, they're not throwing a canopy up over the space. They're putting an object into the space at human level and at storefront level, which is not, in my book, a street tree, and it's very hard to find places in the city where that's the right kind of landscape to do. We do use James Irvin's guidelines for soil volumes for trees, and because as in our experience, it's one of the more rigorous and argued and defended guidelines that we can use, and some people have argued that it's overgenerous, but we're erring on that side. That's totally fine. So I don't know if some of you are familiar with Jim Irvin's. He has this chart about, if a tree is going to eventually become 6-inch caliper, you need 2,000 or 1,200 cubic feet of soil, and it's got to be within a certain, it gets too deep and the roots won't use it. So we use his guidelines, and we won't put the trees in, and we won't put, and we get in trouble for this sometimes, we won't put an elm tree into 600 cubic feet of soil, even when we might have just gone through a public process saying we're going to put elm trees in and everyone loved it, but say we have to go back and say we can't do it if that gets cut out or the soil gets beat. So